Imagine that the commanding general of the United States Army is secretly receiving a monthly salary from the enemy. That is not a hypothetical scenario. That is James Wilkinson. He was the head of the American military under 4 U.S. presidents. But in the secret files of Spanish intelligence, he had a different name, Agent 13. He sold national secrets. He betrayed the coordinates of his own army. He mortgaged his honor for bags of silver. And yet the most terrifying fact is not his treason, but his survival. Why did a traitor of such magnitude die of old age in his bed rather than facing a firing squad? The rot did not begin with a Spanish bribe. It was woven into his very DNA. Long before he was a spy, before he was a traitor, and before he was a general, Wilkinson was a creature of pure, unadulterated ambition, a chameleon searching for the right color to hide his predatory nature. Born in 1757 in Maryland, he entered a world teetering on the edge of violent transformation. He was a second son in a society that favored the first, a detail that perhaps planted the seed of that gnawing, insatiable hunger that would define his entire existence. He wanted what others had, and he wanted it without the tedious necessity of earning it. From a young age, he possessed a gift that became his greatest weapon, a superficial charm so potent it bordered on hypnosis. He was handsome in a soft, fleshy way, with bright eyes that seemed to sparkle with intelligence, though in hindsight, it was merely the gleam of calculation. He studied medicine in Philadelphia, not to heal the sick, but because the title of doctor carried social weight. But when the drums of the Revolution began to beat in 1775, Wilkinson dropped his scalpel and picked up a sword. He sensed with the instinct of a shark detecting blood in the water that war was the fastest ladder a young man could climb. His service in the Revolutionary War serves as a chilling prologue to his later treason, a dress rehearsal for a life of betrayal. While history textbooks celebrate the sacrifices of men at Valley Forge, Wilkinson's war was fought in the warm tents of headquarters, whispering in the ears of powerful generals. He had an uncanny ability to attach himself to rising stars, siphon off their influence, and then abandon them the moment they began to fall. He started as an aide to Benedict Arnold during the invasion of Canada. It is a poetic irony that the man who would become America's greatest unknown traitor learned the art of war from America's most famous traitor. But unlike Arnold, who was a tragic figure driven by perceived slights and genuine bravery, Wilkinson was driven by cold pragmatism. When Arnold's star dimmed, Wilkinson smoothly transferred his loyalty to General Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga. It was under Gates that Wilkinson's true character began to hemorrhage into public view. In 1777, a conspiracy known as the Conway Cabal emerged, a plot by disgruntled officers and politicians to remove George Washington as commander-in-chief and replace him with Horatio Gates. Wilkinson, then a mere 20-year-old colonel, was the loose tongue that sank the ship. While drinking heavily, a vice that would haunt him to his grave, Wilkinson boasted about the plot to another officer. The news reached Washington. The conspiracy was exposed. Gates was humiliated. But notice the pattern. The conspiracy failed. Gates was ruined, but Wilkinson survived. He claimed he was misquoted. He claimed he was innocent. He challenged men to duels to defend his honor. He was promoted to brigadier general at the age of 20, a brevet rank that Congress bestowed upon him mostly to get him to shut up and go away. He was the boy general, a title that fed his narcissism like oil on a fire. However, the war did not end in glory for him. He was eventually forced to resign his commission as clothier general, the officer in charge of supplying uniforms to the army, amidst rampant allegations of corruption. The accounts didn't balance. Money was missing. The soldiers were freezing in rags while Wilkinson lived in luxury. It was the first manifestation of his lifelong philosophy. Public office is a private revenue stream. By the time the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783 establishing the independence of the United States, James Wilkinson was already a broken man in terms of reputation among the inner circle of the Founding Fathers. Washington didn't trust him. The Army didn't want him. He was a man with expensive tastes, a massive ego, and no war left to fight. And so, like many men running from their pasts, he looked west. In the 1780s, the West was Kentucky. It was the edge of the known world, a rugged, violent frontier separated from the civilized East by the formidable Appalachian Mountains. It was a land of opportunity, but also a land of deep political resentment. The settlers in Kentucky felt abandoned by the government in Philadelphia. They were surrounded by hostile Native American tribes, and more importantly, they were economically strangled by Spain. The Spanish Empire controlled the Mississippi River and the vital port of New Orleans. For a Kentucky farmer, the Mississippi was the only road to market. Hauling crops over the mountains to the east was impossible. They needed the river, but Spain had closed it to American traffic, hoping to suffocate the western settlements and force them back into the British or Spanish fold. James Wilkinson arrived in Lexington, Kentucky in 1784, and he did not see a crisis. He saw a marketplace. He saw thousands of angry, desperate farmers who felt no loyalty to a distant American government that couldn't protect them or help them sell their tobacco. Wilkinson opened a general store, but his real inventory was sedition. He used his charm to ingratiate himself with the local elite. He hosted lavish dinners, pouring wine and poison in equal measure. He whispered to the Kentuckians that the United States government had sold them out. He argued that their true interests lay not with the East, but with the South, with the Spanish. He became the loudest voice for Western rights, posing as a patriot fighting for the livelihood of the frontier, while secretly plotting to sell that very frontier to the highest bidder. This brings us to the pivotal year of 1787. It is a year of profound duality in American history. In Philadelphia, 55 men were gathering in a sweltering room to draft the United States Constitution, trying to create a more perfect union. At the exact same moment, James Wilkinson was loading a flotilla of flatboats on the Kentucky River, aiming to tear that union apart before it was even fully formed. Wilkinson's plan was audacious. He loaded his boats with tobacco, ham, and butter, goods that were technically illegal to transport down the Spanish-controlled river. He was risking confiscation, imprisonment, or even death. But Wilkinson was banking on the fatal weakness of others. He knew that the Spanish administration in Louisiana was corrupt, fearful, and desperate for intelligence on the growing American threat. He wasn't just bringing tobacco to New Orleans, he was bringing himself as a weapon. The journey down the Mississippi in the spring of 1787 was a descent into the underworld, both metaphorically and physically. As his boats drifted past the dense, mosquito-infested banks of the river, moving deeper into Spanish territory, Wilkinson was shedding his identity as an American. He was rehearsing the lines he would speak to the Spanish governor. He knew that to succeed, he had to offer them something they couldn't refuse. He had to offer them the destruction of the United States from within. When he finally arrived in New Orleans in July 1787, the city was a sensory overload of French architecture, Spanish laws, and African rhythms. It was the Paris of the wilderness, a city of intrigue where spies and smugglers rubbed shoulders in the coffee houses. Wilkinson, with his flair for the dramatic, did not arrive as a beggar. He arrived as a dignitary. He dressed in his old Continental Army uniform, implying that he spoke for the entire Western population. The Spanish officials, who had been terrified of an invasion by unruly Kentucky backwoodsmen, were relieved to see a man of breeding and authority. Wilkinson secured a meeting with Governor Esteban Rodriguez Miró, a capable but anxious administrator who was constantly looking over his shoulder at the American expansion. In the governor's mansion, amidst the heavy velvet curtains and the smell of cigar smoke, James Wilkinson performed the greatest acting role of his life. He told Miró that Kentucky was on the verge of declaring independence from the United States. He claimed that he, Wilkinson, controlled the sentiment of the people. He lied that he could lead Kentucky into the arms of Spain, creating a buffer state that would protect Mexico's silver mines from American greed. But, he added with a smile, such a massive geopolitical shift required resources. It required money, and it required a man of vision to lead it. Governor Miró was mesmerized. He saw in Wilkinson the answer to all his prayers. If he could secure Kentucky for Spain without firing a shot, he would be a hero in Madrid. He asked Wilkinson to put his proposal in writing, and so James Wilkinson sat down and wrote the first memorial. This document is the smoking gun of his soul. In it, he laid out a detailed assessment of American weaknesses. He listed the names of influential men who could be bribed, but the climax of the document was a personal declaration. In a script that was as flourishing as it was damning, Wilkinson renounced his citizenship. He wrote, "Self-interest regulates the passions of nations as well as individuals, and he who imputes a different motive to human conduct either deceives himself or endeavors to deceive others." It was a manifesto of pure cynicism. He was telling the Spanish explicitly, "I am a man who can be bought, because everyone can be bought." To seal the deal, Wilkinson took a solemn oath of allegiance to the Spanish crown. He swore to defend the Catholic king with his life and his honor. In exchange, he requested two things: exclusive trading rights on the Mississippi River, which would make him a monopoly millionaire back in Kentucky, and a direct pension for his services as a secret agent. Miró agreed. He gave Wilkinson the trading permit immediately and sent the request for the pension to the king in Madrid. He assigned Wilkinson a code number in the Spanish intelligence ledgers. Agent 13 was born. As Wilkinson sailed back to Kentucky later that year, his boats now loaded with Spanish gold and luxury goods, he was no longer just a failed merchant or a disgraced general. He was the wealthiest man in the West. He was a double agent. He was returning to a country he had just sworn to destroy, ready to shake hands with Washington and Jefferson, with the invisible ink of treason still wet on his fingers. He had looked into the abyss of betrayal and found it to be incredibly profitable. But as he ascended the river fighting the current, he could not have known that he was not just initiating a business deal, but starting a psychological war that would consume the next 3 decades of his life. He had become a man with two faces, and eventually the mask would begin to eat into the flesh. The chameleon had found his color, but he was about to discover that maintaining the illusion would require more than just lies. It would require blood, the blood of rivals, the blood of soldiers, and the blood of the very republic that had given him his sword. This was only the beginning. The trap was set, not just for the United States, but for Wilkinson himself. When James Wilkinson returned to Kentucky in the winter of 1788, he did not return as a traitor in the eyes of his neighbors. He returned as a savior. His flatboats were laden with heavy chests of silver, exotic spices, and bolts of fine silk. But more importantly, he carried a piece of paper, a trade monopoly granted by the Spanish governor of Louisiana. for the struggling farmers of the frontier who had watched their crops rot in barns because they couldn't access the Mississippi River. Wilkinson was a miracle worker. He had opened the gates of commerce. They did not ask what he had traded in return. They did not ask why the Spanish, the sworn enemies of American expansion, had suddenly anointed this one man as their chosen conduit. In the blinding light of newfound prosperity, no one looked closely at the shadow cast by the benefactor. This period of Wilkinson's life from 1788 to 1796 represents the most dangerous high-wire act in the history of American espionage. It was here that the Faustian bargain he had struck in New Orleans began to demand its interest payments. Wilkinson was no longer just a private citizen flirting with treason. He was about to re-enter the very heart of the American military establishment, carrying the virus of his betrayal into the bloodstream of the young republic's defense. But first, he had a political failure to weather. Wilkinson's original promise to Spain that he could deliver Kentucky as a colony was crumbling. The ratification of the new United States Constitution in 1789 had changed the mood on the frontier. The new federal government under George Washington promised stability and protection. The angry sentiment of secession began to cool. The conventions in Danville, Kentucky, which Wilkinson had hoped to manipulate into declaring independence, instead voted to petition for statehood within the Union. For a lesser schemer, this would have been the end. He had taken Spanish money to deliver a province, and he had failed. Governor Miro in New Orleans was growing impatient. The flow of pension money began to stutter. Wilkinson stood at a crossroads. He could retreat into obscurity as a wealthy merchant, or he could double down. His fatal weakness, that insatiable need for relevance and power, made the choice inevitable. If he could not be the president of a new Western republic, he would become the general of the American army, and he would use that position to make himself even more valuable to Spain. In 1791, utilizing his connections and his reputation as a knowledgeable frontiersman, Wilkinson successfully lobbied President Washington for a commission. It is a testament to his slippery charisma that he was appointed a lieutenant colonel in the regular army. The fox was not just in the henhouse. The fox had been made head of security. However, Wilkinson soon found himself in a position that his ego could barely tolerate. He was not the top dog. That honor belonged to General Anthony Wayne, a man known to history as Mad Anthony. The rivalry between James Wilkinson and Anthony Wayne is one of the most toxic and dramatic personal conflicts in American history. It was a collision of opposites. Wayne was a true warrior, brave, aggressive, disciplined, and fiercely loyal to George Washington. He was a man of action who slept in the mud with his troops. Wilkinson, by contrast, was a man of the court, a polished intriguer who preferred the comfort of a warm headquarters and the subtle art of character assassination. From the moment Wayne was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Legion of the United States in 1792, Wilkinson began a systematic campaign to destroy him. This was not merely professional jealousy, it was a survival necessity for Agent 13. Wayne was sharp. Wayne was suspicious. If Wayne ever turned his keen tactical eye toward his second-in-command's finances, Wilkinson would hang. Thus began the secret war within the Indian Wars. While Anthony Wayne was drilling troops to fight the Native American Confederacy in Ohio, Wilkinson was fighting a war on two fronts. On one front, he was anonymously writing poison pen letters to politicians in Philadelphia, accusing Wayne of incompetence, drunkenness, and tyranny. He planted rumors in newspapers. He encouraged insubordination among the junior officers, trying to spark a mutiny that would disgrace Wayne. On the second front, Wilkinson was actively betraying the Army's movements to the Spanish. By 1794, the geopolitical situation was razor thin. Spain was terrified that Wayne's army, once it defeated the Native Americans, would turn south and invade Louisiana. The new Spanish governor, the Baron de Carondelet, was even more paranoid than his predecessor. Wilkinson played on these fears like a maestro. He re-established his secret channel with Carondelet. In coded dispatches sent down the Mississippi, Agent 13 provided the Spanish with the exact strength, condition, and location of Wayne's forces. He analyzed Wayne's personality for the enemy, advising them on how to manipulate the general. He even went so far as to suggest that he, Wilkinson, was the only thing holding Wayne back from attacking Spanish territory. He demanded more money, thousands of dollars in arrears, to keep the mad dog Wayne on a leash. The depth of this betrayal is breathtaking. Wilkinson was the second highest ranking officer in the Army. He was drawing a salary from the U.S. Treasury to support Wayne, while simultaneously drawing a pension from the Spanish Treasury to sabotage him. He was effectively betting against his own soldiers. If Wayne won, the U.S. grew stronger. Bad for Wilkinson's Spanish narrative. If Wayne lost and the army was destroyed, Wilkinson would likely be promoted to replace him. Good for Wilkinson. He had engineered a win-win scenario for himself built entirely on the potential corpses of American troops. The climax of this duplicity came during the campaign of the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. As Wayne marched his army deep into hostile territory to face the combined forces of the tribes, who were backed by the British, Wilkinson was actively undermining morale. He criticized every decision Wayne made. He whispered to fellow officers that Wayne was leading them into a trap, that the mad general had finally lost his mind. But Wayne won. At the Battle of Fallen Timbers, Anthony Wayne achieved a decisive victory that broke the power of the tribal confederacy and secured the Northwest Territory for the United States. It was a triumph of generalship that should have ended Wilkinson's career. Wayne returned a hero, and more dangerously for Wilkinson, Wayne had begun to figure it out. In the aftermath of the victory, General Wayne began to piece together the puzzle of his subordinates' treachery. He intercepted couriers. He heard whispers from Spanish deserters. He realized that the constant friction, the leaks, the insubordination, it all led back to Wilkinson. Wayne began to quietly compile a dossier. He gathered evidence of Wilkinson's Spanish connections. He was preparing to court-martial James Wilkinson for treason. The year 1796 should have been the end of Agent 13. The net was closing. Wayne had the authority, the credibility, and the evidence to send Wilkinson to the firing squad. Wilkinson was desperate. He wrote frantic letters to his Spanish handlers, claiming that he was being persecuted for his friendship with Spain. He knew that if Wayne lived to return to Philadelphia and present his findings to President Washington, the game was over. And then the devil's luck intervened. In December 1796, as Anthony Wayne was traveling from Detroit to Philadelphia, carrying the evidence that would destroy Wilkinson, he was suddenly struck down by a violent illness. It was agonizing. It was rapid. He died in Erie, Pennsylvania on December 15, 1796. The timing of Anthony Wayne's death is one of the great what-ifs of American history. Was it natural causes? He was 51 years old and had lived a hard life. It was likely gout or complications from an old wound. But for Wilkinson, it was divine intervention. Or perhaps something darker. While there is no definitive proof that Wilkinson poisoned Wayne, the convenience of the death was not lost on their contemporaries. Wilkinson had a background in medicine. He knew poisons, and he had the most to gain. With Wayne dead, the dossier disappeared. The investigation evaporated, and, by the rigid rules of seniority in the U.S. Army, the mantle of command passed to the next senior officer. On that cold December day, James Wilkinson became the senior officer of the United States Army. The fox had not only survived the hunt, he had inherited the estate. The man who was Agent 13 on the Spanish payroll was now the commanding general of the forces he was paid to undermine. This transition marks a shift in the psychological landscape of the story. Up until now, Wilkinson had been a climber, a scrappy underdog fighting for position. Now he was the establishment. The double commander era had begun, but holding power proved to be far more complex than seizing it. Wilkinson moved quickly to consolidate his control. He purged the army of officers loyal to Wayne, replacing them with his own sycophants. He redesigned the uniforms, adding more gold lace and feathers, turning the army into a reflection of his own vanity. He moved the headquarters to the frontier, far from the prying eyes of the politicians in Philadelphia and later Washington, D.C. But the fatal weakness, his addiction to intrigue, would not let him rest. He was now the highest military authority in the land, but his spending habits were out of control. The salary of a general was insufficient for the lifestyle of a prince. He needed the Spanish money more than ever. In 1797, he engaged in a secret negotiation with the Spanish governor Gioso to protect his pension. But the world was changing. The French Revolution had exploded. Napoleon was rising. The intricate chess game of European empires was spilling over into North America. The Spanish were becoming weaker, terrified that the Americans or the British would seize their colonies. Wilkinson used his new rank to terrorize his paymasters. He essentially engaged in a protection racket. He told the Spanish, "I am now the head of the American army. If you stop paying me, I cannot guarantee that I won't invade you. But if you pay me, I will ensure the American army remains inactive." It was a brilliant, monstrous extortion. He was selling non-invasion. He kept the U.S. Army small, disorganized, and spread thin across the frontier, ostensibly to protect settlers, but in reality, to ensure it was never concentrated enough to pose a credible threat to New Orleans or Mexico. He sabotaged his own institution to please his clients. As the 18th century drew to a close and the 1800s dawned, Wilkinson sat at the pinnacle of his power. He had survived the Revolution, the Conway Cabal, the failure of the Kentucky Separation, and the wrath of Mad Anthony Wayne. He was the most powerful man in the West. But a new player was about to enter the game, a man of intellect and idealism who would inadvertently hand Wilkinson the keys to his greatest betrayal yet. Thomas Jefferson was elected president in 1800. Jefferson, the philosopher king, the man of the Enlightenment, had a vision of an empire of liberty. He trusted Wilkinson. He believed Wilkinson was a fellow Republican, a patriot of the frontier. He had no idea that he was handing the security of his new administration to a man who viewed liberty as just another commodity to be weighed on a scale of silver coins. The stage was set for the next act. The purchase of Louisiana was on the horizon, a transaction that would change the map of the world. And lurking in the shadows of that transaction was Agent 13, ready to sell the secrets of a continent. The double commander was about to become the merchant of secrets. The turn of the 19th century was more than a change of dates on a calendar. It was a seismic shift in the soul of the American experiment. In 1801, Thomas Jefferson ascended to the presidency, marking the first peaceful transfer of power between opposing political parties in modern history. He called it the Revolution of 1800. Jefferson was a visionary, a man who dreamed of an empire of liberty stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, a vast agrarian paradise where free men could till their own soil, under the watchful eye of a benevolent republic. He looked at the map of North America and saw destiny. James Wilkinson looked at the same map and saw rent. This era, from 1801 to 1804, represents the zenith of Wilkinson's duplicity. It was the period where he transitioned from a mere military opportunist into the merchant of secrets, a broker of geopolitical intelligence who operated a one-man clearinghouse for treason at the highest levels of government. The tragedy of this chapter lies in the relationship between these two men. Jefferson, the philosopher king who trusted too easily, and Wilkinson, the predator who consumed that trust with a voracious appetite. To understand how Wilkinson survived the transition from the Federalist administration of Adams to the Republican administration of Jefferson, one must appreciate his chameleon-like ability to adapt his plumage. Wilkinson knew that Jefferson despised the pomp and ceremony of the standing army. He knew Jefferson feared a monarchist military coup. So Wilkinson reinvented himself again. He shed the gold lace and the aristocratic airs of the previous decade. He began to write long, flowery letters to Jefferson, praising the virtues of Republican simplicity, discussing botany, geography, and Native American anthropology. He played to Jefferson's intellectual vanity. He presented himself not as a soldier, but as a warrior scholar, a fellow man of the Enlightenment stranded on the savage frontier. Jefferson, usually so astute, was completely beguiled. He saw in Wilkinson a kindred spirit, a man who understood the West. In a decision that now reads like the opening scene of a horror movie, Jefferson not only retained Wilkinson as the senior officer of the Army, but also appointed him the first governor of the newly acquired Louisiana Territory. The fox was no longer just guarding the henhouse. He had been given the deed to the farm. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 is rightly celebrated as Jefferson's greatest triumph. For $15 million, the United States doubled its size overnight, acquiring the vast, undefined lands west of the Mississippi River. To the Americans, it was a glorious expansion. To the Spanish, it was a nightmare realized. Spain had retroceded Louisiana to France, expecting Napoleon to act as a buffer against the Americans. Instead, Napoleon had sold it to the United States. Suddenly, the aggressive, land-hungry Americans were banging on the doors of Texas and New Mexico. In Madrid and Mexico City, panic set in. The Spanish Empire was rotting from within, terrified that this flood of democracy would wash away their silver mines. They needed eyes and ears inside the new administration. They needed to know Jefferson's intentions. Was he planning to stop at the Mississippi, or was he eyeing the Rio Grande? Enter Agent 13. In the spring of 1804, the merchant of secrets opened his shop for business. Wilkinson was now stationed in New Orleans, the city of his original sin. He was the highest authority of the United States in the region, tasked with overseeing the peaceful transfer of power. Yet his nights were spent in clandestine meetings with the Marquis of Casa Calvo, a Spanish boundary commissioner who remained in the city. The dynamic had shifted. In the past, Wilkinson had begged Spain for money. Now, Spain begged him for information. And the information they wanted most concerned a secret project that was close to Jefferson's heart, the core of discovery. For years, Jefferson had been planning a scientific and military expedition to explore the West, find the source of the Missouri River, and discover the fabled Northwest Passage to the Pacific. He had chosen his personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis, and William Clark to lead it. To Jefferson, this was a mission of science, collecting flora, fauna, and vocabularies of Indian tribes. But to Spain, an armed American military unit marching toward their silver mines in Santa Fe was an act of war. Wilkinson knew everything. As the commanding general, he had helped outfit the expedition. He knew their route. He knew their supplies. He knew their diplomatic instructions. And he decided to sell it all. The betrayal of Lewis and Clark represents the darkest aspect of Wilkinson's character distilled into its purest, most toxic form. It was not a betrayal born of necessity. He was rich. He was powerful. He was the governor. He did it because he could not resist the game. He did it because providing the ultimate intelligence made him feel like a god, pulling the strings of empires. In March 1804, Wilkinson penned a document known as Reflections on the Political State of the Province of Louisiana. It was intended for the eyes of Vicente Foch, the Spanish governor of West Florida. In this text, Wilkinson did not merely leak the existence of the Lewis and Clark expedition. He analyzed its threat level with the cold precision of a military strategist working for the enemy. He wrote that the expedition was merely the vanguard of a massive American invasion. He warned that if Lewis and Clark were allowed to reach the Pacific, the United States would claim the entire continent, encircling Spain's Mexican possessions. He stoked the deepest fears of the Spanish court. But then, Agent 13 offered a solution. In a passage that chills the blood of any American reading it, 2 centuries later, Wilkinson suggested that Spain should not sit idly by. He recommended that the Spanish authorities dispatch a heavy detachment of cavalry from Santa Fe to intercept the explorers. His advice was explicit. Stop them. He knew exactly what stopping them meant in the lawless wilderness. It meant arrest, imprisonment in a Mexican dungeon, or death. He was signing the death warrant of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. He was suggesting the assassination of America's greatest explorers to protect his own pension. Let us visualize the scene. Wilkinson, sitting in the governor's mansion in New Orleans, dipping his quill into the inkwell. Outside, American flags are waving, celebrating the new territory. Inside, the governor is writing a letter that could spark a war between the U.S. and Spain, a war that he, as general, would be paid to fight, and as a spy, would be paid to lose. He handed this intelligence to his courier, waiting for the bag of Spanish silver dollars in return. The transaction was complete. The merchant had sold the future. Fate, however, played a strange hand. The Spanish administration, bloated and bureaucratic, moved too slowly. By the time the orders reached the frontier outposts in New Mexico, and by the time the Spanish troops, 4 detachments in total, were scrambled to find the Americans, Lewis and Clark had already slipped through the net. They had moved up the Missouri River faster than Wilkinson anticipated. The Spanish dragoons rode out into the vast emptiness of the Great Plains, searching for the American boats, but they found only wind and grass. Lewis and Clark survived not because of Wilkinson's mercy, but because of the sheer vastness of the American West. They went on to make history, unaware that the man who had shaken their hands at the start of their journey had placed a knife in their backs. But Wilkinson's treachery in 1804 went beyond just Lewis and Clark. He was engaged in a systematic effort to monetize his governorship. He imposed arbitrary regulations on trade in New Orleans, regulations that could be bypassed, of course, for a fee. He treated the terrified French and Spanish inhabitants of the city with disdain, alienating the very people Jefferson hoped to assimilate. He was a tyrant in a republic's clothing. Reports of his corruption began to trickle back to Washington. Residents of New Orleans wrote letters complaining of his arrogance, his speculation, and his strange intimacy with Spanish officials. But Jefferson, blinded by his own optimism, and perhaps unwilling to admit he had made a mistake, dismissed these complaints as the grumbling of royalists who hated democracy. This creates a philosophical tragedy. Jefferson believed that liberty would naturally produce virtuous citizens. Wilkinson proved that liberty also provides the perfect cover for vice. In a free society, a man like Wilkinson could hide in plain sight, using the protections of the law to dismantle the law. As 1804 drew to a close, Wilkinson sat atop a precarious throne. He was wealthy, but he was bleeding money. He was powerful, but he was surrounded by enemies. He had betrayed his country, his president, and his subordinates. But the adrenaline of the Lewis and Clark betrayal had worn off. He needed a new fix. He needed a bigger game. The mere selling of secrets was becoming boring. The merchant wanted to become an emperor. And just as this hunger for a grander destiny began to gnaw at him, a boat arrived in New Orleans carrying a man who was arguably the only person in America as ambitious and damaged as Wilkinson himself. Aaron Burr, the Vice President of the United States, had just killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel. Burr was a fugitive from the law in New York and New Jersey. He was a political corpse in Washington, but in the West, he saw resurrection. When Wilkinson and Burr met, the chemistry was instantaneous and toxic. It was the meeting of two dark stars, the merchant of secrets and the killer of Hamilton. Together, they would look at the map of the West and decide that selling it wasn't enough. They were going to steal it. The era of simple espionage was over. The era of the Burr conspiracy was about to begin. If the year 1804 was defined by the solitary treachery of the merchant of secrets selling out Lewis and Clark, then 1805 marked the beginning of a conspiracy so vast and audacious that it threatened to redraw the map of North America. It was the year two dark stars collided in the firmament of the early republic, creating a gravitational pull that would nearly tear the Union apart. James Wilkinson was the general of the army and the governor of the Louisiana Territory. Aaron Burr was the vice president of the United States, soon to be former, and the man who had recently put a bullet in the heart of Alexander Hamilton. History often pairs them as partners, but they were more akin to two predators stalking the same prey, temporarily agreeing to hunt together. Their meeting was inevitable. Both men were brilliant, charismatic, and utterly devoid of the moral compass that guided their peers. Both felt wronged by the establishment. Both believed that the United States was a fragile, failing experiment, a paper republic that was destined to fracture into smaller, more manageable empires. And both men saw themselves not as citizens, but as Caesars in waiting. The conspiracy began in earnest in the summer of 1805. Aaron Burr, now a political pariah in Washington, traveled west down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. He was ostensibly on a tour of the frontier looking for land to settle. In reality, he was recruiting. He was looking for men who were tired of the slow grind of democracy, men who wanted glory, gold, and a king to follow. When Burr's barge docked at Fort Massac on the Ohio River, James Wilkinson was waiting for him. They spent 4 days together. No minutes were kept of their conversations. No secretaries were present. But we can reconstruct the dialogue from the actions that followed. This was the birth of the Burr conspiracy. The plan they hatched in those smoke-filled rooms was a masterpiece of ambiguity. This was their genius. To different people, they sold different versions of the dream. To the American settlers in the West, they whispered that the federal government in Washington didn't care about them. They hinted that the West should separate, forming a new nation that would protect its own interests. To the British minister in Washington, Anthony Merry, Burr promised to detach Louisiana from the Union in exchange for Royal Navy support and $500,000. To the Spanish, Wilkinson, playing his Agent 13 role, whispered that Burr was planning to invade Mexico and only he, Wilkinson, could stop him, for a price of course. But between themselves, the emperor and his general likely shared the wildest dream of all, an invasion of Spanish Mexico. They would raise a private army of frontiersmen, march into Texas, seize the silver mines, and then push south to Mexico City. There, they would establish a new dynasty. It was a vision of Napoleonic grandeur. Burr would be the Emperor of Mexico. Wilkinson would be the Generalissimo, the power behind the throne. It was treason against the United States by stealing its army/territory, and an act of war against Spain by invading a sovereign neighbor. It was the ultimate double game. James Wilkinson's tragic flaw during this period was his blinding arrogance. He believed he could control Aaron Burr. He saw Burr as a tool, a brilliant political operator who could raise the money and the men, while Wilkinson provided the military muscle and the logistics. Wilkinson believed he was the puppet master. He didn't realize that in Aaron Burr he had met a man whose ambition was even more reckless than his own. Throughout 1805 and 1806, the conspiracy moved from talk to action. It was a logistical operation of staggering complexity. Burr was in the East, charming wealthy backers, purchasing supplies, and arranging for boats to be built on the Ohio River. Wilkinson was in the West, positioning his troops. The communication between them relied on a sophisticated cipher letter. This code, based on a specific edition of Intick's Pocket Dictionary, allowed them to communicate their treason in plain sight. These letters, which would later become the most famous evidence in American legal history, reveal a tone of breathless excitement. In one decoded letter, Wilkinson wrote to Burr, "The gods invite us to glory and fortune. It remains to be seen whether we deserve the boon." Glory and fortune. These were the twin idols of Wilkinson's religion. He began to shuffle the U.S. Army like a deck of cards. He moved troops toward the Spanish border not to defend the United States, but to create a provocation. His strategy was devilishly simple. He needed a war. If he could provoke a skirmish with Spanish troops on the Texas border, he could claim self-defense, rally the patriotic fervor of the West, and launch the invasion of Mexico before President Jefferson in Washington could tell him to stop. He was manufacturing a war to serve his private conspiracy. But as 1806 wore on, the Emperor of the West began to feel the ground shaking. The conspiracy was too big. It had too many moving parts. Rumors were leaking. Newspapers in Kentucky, specifically the Western world, began to publish sensational exposés about a Spanish plot involving Wilkinson and Burr. This is where the psychological profile of Wilkinson diverges sharply from Burr. Aaron Burr was a visionary, willing to risk everything for the dream. If the ship went down, Burr was the type of captain who would lash himself to the mast. James Wilkinson, however, was a survivor. He was a rat who knew exactly when the ship had taken on too much water. In the autumn of 1806, Wilkinson was at Natchitoches, on the very edge of the Texas border. He had his army. He had his war provocation ready. Across the Sabine River, Spanish troops were massing, terrified of the American advance. The stage was set. Burr was moving down the river with his flotilla of gunboats and recruits, expecting Wilkinson to open the gates of Mexico for him. But Wilkinson hesitated. He received letters from Burr indicating that the project was launching. "Everything is ready," Burr wrote. "The clans are gathering." Wilkinson read these words and felt a cold chill of reality. He realized that Jefferson finally knew. He realized the Spanish knew. He calculated the odds. If he went forward with Burr, he would be gambling his life on a roll of the dice. If they failed, he would hang. But Wilkinson saw another path, a path that only a man with no soul could see. He realized that he could become the hero of the story by destroying the very plot he had helped create. He could sell Burr out. The fatal weakness flipped. His greed for power was replaced by a desperate feral need for self-preservation. In October 1806, Wilkinson made the most consequential decision of his life. He decided to betray Aaron Burr. But he wouldn't just betray him, he would destroy him so completely that no one would notice Wilkinson's own fingerprints on the weapon. He sat down and wrote a letter to President Thomas Jefferson. It was a masterpiece of deception. "Sir," Wilkinson wrote, his pen scratching across the parchment with frantic energy, "a deep, dark, and wicked conspiracy has been formed to sever the Union and drench the nation in blood." He did not mention that he was the co-author of this conspiracy. He painted himself as the shocked, loyal soldier who had just discovered the plot. He claimed that he and he alone stood between the Republic and destruction. He told Jefferson that he would make a truce with the Spanish, illegally ending the very war he tried to start, so he could turn his army around to face the internal traitor, Aaron Burr. This moment, in the fall of 1806, is the turning point of the entire saga. It is the moment the Emperor of the West died, and the headhunter was born. Wilkinson didn't just switch sides, he switched realities. He essentially told Jefferson, "I am not the arsonist, I am the fireman." But to make this lie work, Wilkinson needed chaos. He needed to create an atmosphere of such hysteria that no one would have time to ask questions. He needed a reign of terror. He ordered his troops to march to New Orleans. He wasn't going there to defend the city from Burr, who had only a few dozen ragged followers and posed no real threat. He was going there to seize the city for himself. He was going to declare martial law, arrest his enemies, silence the press, and turn New Orleans into his personal fortress. As he rode south, leaving the bewildered Spanish troops behind him at the border, James Wilkinson was a man possessed. He had to reach New Orleans before the truth did. He had to bury the evidence. He had to intercept Burr's letters. He had to find the witnesses who knew about his involvement and lock them away in damp cells where their voices couldn't be heard. The Emperor was dead. Long live the Savior. But Aaron Burr, drifting down the Mississippi with his dreams of glory, had no idea. He thought he was sailing toward a coronation. He didn't know he was sailing into the jaws of a monster who had already sold him to the executioner for the price of a pardon. The great betrayal had begun. Betrayal is usually an act of passion, a moment of weakness, anger, or fear. But for James Wilkinson, betrayal was an act of administrative procedure. It was a cold calculation of risk versus reward, performed with the detachment of a surgeon cutting off a gangrenous limb. The limb in this case was Aaron Burr, and the patient Wilkinson was trying to save was himself. In the autumn of 1806, the conspiracy had reached its point of no return. The Emperor, Aaron Burr, was moving down the Ohio River with his followers, believing the plan was in motion. He thought Wilkinson was waiting for him at the gates of Texas, ready to unleash the United States Army against the Spanish. But Wilkinson, stationed at his command post in Natchitoches, was staring at a map and realizing the math didn't add up. The catalyst for the great betrayal arrived in the hands of a young man named Samuel Swartwout. Swartwout was one of Burr's most loyal lieutenants, a wide-eyed idealist who believed he was part of a glorious revolution. He had ridden hundreds of miles through the wilderness to deliver a packet of letters to General Wilkinson. He thought he was delivering the final instructions for victory. In reality, he was delivering his own death warrant. Inside the packet was the infamous cipher letter of July 29th, 1806. It was written in the complex code Wilkinson and Burr shared. When Wilkinson decoded it in the privacy of his tent, the words shimmered with reckless ambition. I have obtained funds and have actually commenced the enterprise. Detachments from different points and under different pretenses will rendezvous on the Ohio. The gods invite us to glory and fortune. It remains to be seen whether we deserve the boon. Burr went on to detail that he would be in New Orleans soon with his army, which he grossly exaggerated to inspire Wilkinson, and expected Wilkinson to be ready. A different man might have been inspired. Wilkinson was terrified. He held in his hands physical proof of treason. If this letter was captured, or if the plot failed, and Wilkinson, with his ear to the ground, knew that rumors were already swirling in Washington, he would be hanged alongside Burr. The fatal weakness of Wilkinson kicked in. His survival instinct was a black hole that swallowed all other loyalties. Wilkinson realized he had two choices. Option A, honor the pact, invade Mexico, and hope they win before the U.S. government crushes them. Option B, turn on Burr, claim he was a spy for the government all along, and use the crisis to consolidate his own power. He chose option B, but he didn't just choose it. He executed it with a Machiavellian brilliance that leaves one breathless. The first step was to rewrite the narrative. Wilkinson took the cipher letter and began to copy it for President Jefferson. But he didn't just copy it, he edited it. He acted as the censor of his own crime. He carefully removed the opening sentence where Burr acknowledged receiving a letter from Wilkinson. Your letter was received. By deleting this line, Wilkinson removed the evidence that he had been communicating with Burr. He transformed a dialogue into a monologue. In his version, Burr was a madman shouting at a wall, and Wilkinson was the innocent observer. He then penned a cover letter to President Jefferson. It is one of the most audacious documents in American history. He described a deep, dark, and wicked conspiracy that was sweeping down the Mississippi like a plague. He warned that Burr, though he initially didn't name him, he implied it heavily, was coming with thousands of bandits to sack New Orleans, loot the banks, and sever the Union. I shall, Wilkinson wrote with feigned heroism, throw myself into New Orleans and defend it with my life. This was the big lie. Burr didn't have thousands of bandits. He had fewer than 100 settlers on flatboats. He wasn't coming to sack New Orleans. He was coming because he thought Wilkinson had invited him. But Wilkinson needed a monster to fight so he could be the hero. He needed to create a panic so great that no one would notice his own hands were dirty. The second step of the betrayal was even more cynical. Wilkinson was currently sitting on the border of Texas, facing the Spanish army. He had spent months trying to provoke a war with them to serve the conspiracy. Now he needed that war to stop immediately so he could rush his troops back to New Orleans to save it from Burr. He approached the Spanish commander, Simón de Herrera. For months, these two had been staring each other down, muskets loaded. Now Wilkinson proposed a truce. He effectively told the Spanish, I have a bigger problem behind me. If you agree to stay on your side of the river, I will leave you alone and go deal with a traitor in my own country. The result was the Neutral Ground Treaty of 1806. It created a buffer zone between Louisiana and Texas where no army would enter, a lawless strip of land that would become a haven for outlaws for years. But for Wilkinson, it was a getaway car. He signed the treaty, turned his army around, and marched toward New Orleans at double speed. He was racing against the truth. As he marched, he began the purge. He ordered the arrest of the very messengers who had brought him the letters. Samuel Swartwout and another courier, Eric Bowman, were seized. These men were confused. They told the arresting officers, but we are friends of the general. We brought him news. It didn't matter. Wilkinson had them thrown in chains. He denied them lawyers. He denied them trial. He shipped them off to Washington, D.C. on a Navy vessel with instructions that they were dangerous traitors. Why? Because they were witnesses. They knew Wilkinson was part of the plot. By arresting them as terrorists, he discredited anything they might say. If they accused him, he could simply say, "Of course they accuse me. They are traitors trying to bring down the man who caught them." It was a master class in gaslighting. By the time Wilkinson reached New Orleans in November 1806, he had fully inhabited his new persona, the savior of the Republic. New Orleans was a city on edge. The French and Spanish population didn't trust the Americans. The Americans didn't trust each other. Into this powder keg rode James Wilkinson, wearing his full-dress uniform, his face a mask of grim determination. He didn't try to calm the city. He poured gasoline on the fire. He gathered the city merchants and told them that a horde was coming. He spoke of Burr as if he were Attila the Hun. He claimed Burr was coming to incite a slave rebellion, a primal fear in the South, to seize the banks, to burn the city. He whipped the populace into a frenzy of terror. Why create such panic over a non-existent threat? Because panic justifies power. Wilkinson demanded that the governor of Louisiana, who was actually his subordinate in the territory hierarchy, declare martial law. When the governor hesitated, citing the Constitution, Wilkinson effectively brushed him aside. He began to fortify the city. He barricaded the streets. He embargoed the port, stopping all trade, which ruined many merchants, but allowed Wilkinson to control the flow of goods and likely profit from it. He was creating a state of exception. In this state, the normal laws did not apply. The Constitution was suspended. The only law was the word of the general. And the most tragic irony of the great betrayal? He was doing all of this, the panic, the arrests, the mobilization of the army, while still on the payroll of Spain. Agent 13 was still active. In fact, he tried to bill the Spanish viceroy for his services in stopping Burr. He wrote to the viceroy in Mexico City, demanding over $100,000. His logic was twisted but consistent. "I just saved Mexico from an invasion by Aaron Burr. You owe me." He was charging the U.S. government for saving New Orleans and charging the Spanish government for saving Mexico. He was eating from both troughs, even as the world around him descended into chaos. As 1806 turned into 1807, Aaron Burr was drifting down the Mississippi, completely unaware that his partner had become his executioner. He stopped at tiny settlements, gathering supplies, thinking he was days away from glory. He didn't know that downriver James Wilkinson was building a cage for him. He didn't know that the President of the United States had issued a proclamation declaring him a traitor based entirely on Wilkinson's lies. The great betrayal was complete. Wilkinson had successfully pivoted. He was no longer a conspirator. He was the government's chief witness. He had sold his soul, bought it back, and sold it again at a markup. But now he had to maintain the charade. He had to face Burr in a courtroom and look him in the eye without blinking. The merchant of secrets was about to enter the theater of the absurd. If the definition of tyranny is the arbitrary exercise of power without the constraint of law, then for a few feverish months in the winter of 1806 and 1807, James Wilkinson was the only true tyrant to ever rule on American soil. Having successfully sold the narrative of a barbarian invasion to President Jefferson, Wilkinson transformed New Orleans from a bustling port city into a personal police state. The savior of the Republic did not bring peace. He brought a silence so heavy it felt like suffocation. The Reign of Terror in New Orleans is a chapter often glossed over in the biographies of the Founding Fathers because it sits so uncomfortably alongside the ideals of the Constitution. We like to imagine that the Bill of Rights is a shield that protects citizens at all times. Wilkinson proved that the shield is made of paper, easily pierced by a bayonet, if the man holding the weapon claims it is for national security. Wilkinson's strategy was simple: absolute intimidation. He knew that if the local courts were allowed to function, the witnesses he had arrested, Eric Bowman, Samuel Swartwout, and Peter Ogden, would be released on writs of habeas corpus. A judge would ask, "Where is the evidence?" And Wilkinson had none other than his own word and the altered letters. So, Wilkinson declared war on the judiciary. When Judge James Workman of the Territorial Court issued writs demanding the release of the prisoners, Wilkinson ignored them. When the judge persisted, Wilkinson sent soldiers into the courtroom. Imagine the scene: a court of law, the sanctuary of justice, invaded by armed troops acting on the orders of a general who was simultaneously a Spanish spy. Wilkinson threatened to arrest the judge himself. He famously declared, "The commander of the army must not be restricted by forms and technicalities." To Wilkinson, the Constitution was a technicality. He instituted a curfew. He intercepted mail. He placed spies in coffee houses. Anyone who questioned his authority was labeled a Burrite and a traitor. He was creating a binary world. You were either with Wilkinson and thus a patriot, or you were against him and thus an enemy of the state. It was a masterclass in authoritarian gaslighting. He used the phantom menace of Aaron Burr, who was still floating aimlessly down the river with a pathetic force of fewer than 100 men, to justify the suspension of all civil liberties. The most chilling aspect of this reign was its commercial dimension. Wilkinson, ever the merchant, used the crisis to settle old scores and line his pockets. He enforced an embargo on the river, stopping trade. Ships rotted at the docks. Merchants went bankrupt. But mysteriously, certain ships, those belonging to Wilkinson's friends or business associates, were granted special passes to sail. He was monetizing the panic. He was essentially running a protection racket under the guise of national defense. Meanwhile, the monster Aaron Burr finally arrived in the territory, but he arrived with a whimper, not a roar. When Burr realized that Wilkinson had betrayed him, that the gates of New Orleans were barred and the newspapers were calling for his head, he was stunned. The brilliant political tactician had been outmaneuvered by the brute. Burr tried to flee, disguised in the rags of a riverboatman, but he was captured in Alabama in February 1807. The image of Burr's capture is tragic. The former Vice President of the United States, a man of intellect and refinement, was dragged through the mud, shivering and broken. But the greater tragedy was that his captor, the moral victor in the eyes of the public, was James Wilkinson, a man who had committed treason 10 times over compared to Burr's half-baked schemes. With Burr in chains, the scene shifted from the swamps of Louisiana to the aristocratic parlors of Richmond, Virginia. The reign of terror ended, but the theater of the absurd was just beginning. The trial of Aaron Burr in 1807 was the first true trial of the century in American history. It was a spectacle that drew the entire nation's attention. It was not just a legal proceeding. It was a political death match between the executive branch, President Jefferson, and the judiciary, Chief Justice John Marshall, with Aaron Burr caught in the middle. And the star witness for the prosecution? The mammoth of iniquity himself, James Wilkinson. Wilkinson arrived in Richmond in June 1807. He expected a hero's welcome. He rode into town in full-dress uniform, his gold epaulets gleaming, his belly straining against his sash. He brought with him a retinue of aides, expecting to be feted as the man who saved the Union. But Richmond was not New Orleans. Here he could not arrest his critics, and here the public knew him. The atmosphere in Richmond was electric with hatred. To the Federalists, Wilkinson was a tool of Jefferson. To the Republicans who knew the truth, he was an embarrassment. To the common man, he was a grotesque figure of excess. A young lawyer named Washington Irving, who would later write The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, observed Wilkinson in court and described him as a man who strutted about for a few days with a swelling chest and a nose held high, but who soon deflated under the scrutiny of the courtroom. The confrontation between Burr and Wilkinson on June 15, 1807, is a moment of pure cinematic tension. When Wilkinson entered the courtroom, he scanned the crowd with an air of arrogance. Then his eyes locked with Aaron Burr. Burr did not flinch. He did not look away. He stared at Wilkinson with a gaze of such cold, piercing contempt that witnesses said it felt like a physical blow. Wilkinson, the bully who had terrorized New Orleans, crumbled. He stammered. He looked at the floor. He sweated profusely. In that silent exchange, the power dynamic flipped. Burr might have been the prisoner, but Wilkinson was the one on trial in the court of public opinion. The fatal weakness of Wilkinson, his pathological need to be the hero, backfired spectacularly on the witness stand. Burr's defense team, led by the brilliant Luther Martin, dissected him. They demanded to see the letters. They asked about the erasures in the cipher letter. They asked about his pension from Spain. General Wilkinson, the defense attorney asked, "Can you explain why the opening line of this letter, acknowledging your previous correspondence with Mr. Burr, has been erased?" Wilkinson blustered. He claimed he erased it to remove confidential information that wasn't relevant. He claimed he had forgotten what the original words were. He lied, and everyone in the room knew he was lying. He was perjury personified. The grand jury foreman was John Randolph of Roanoke, a fierce, eccentric politician who possessed a nose for corruption like a bloodhound. Randolph listened to Wilkinson's testimony and was disgusted. He famously told the court that Wilkinson was the only man I ever saw who was a villain from the bark to the very core. Randolph wanted to indict Wilkinson alongside Burr. He saw the strings. He saw that Burr was merely the junior partner in a firm where Wilkinson was the CEO. But here is where the philosophy of power intervenes. Justice is rarely blind. It is often just pragmatism in a robe. President Jefferson had staked his entire political reputation on convicting Aaron Burr. He needed Wilkinson. Wilkinson was his primary source, his star witness. If Wilkinson fell, the government's case collapsed. So the machinery of the state went into overdrive to protect the traitor. The prosecutors were instructed to shield Wilkinson. Evidence of his Spanish connections was suppressed. The President of the United States effectively became the defense attorney for a Spanish spy, solely to secure the conviction of a political rival. It is a damning indictment of the early republic. The system protected Wilkinson not because it believed him, but because it couldn't afford to expose him. He was too big to fail. In the end, the trial ended in an anticlimax. Chief Justice John Marshall, applying a strict interpretation of the Constitution, ruled that the government had failed to prove an overt act of treason. Talk is not treason. Only war is treason. Since Burr hadn't actually started shooting, he couldn't be convicted. Burr walked free, but he was a ruined man, destined to wander Europe in exile, fleeing creditors and memories. Wilkinson also walked free. He narrowly escaped indictment by a vote of 9-7 in the grand jury. He kept his rank, he kept his command, but he lost something he could never buy back with Spanish gold: his reputation. He left Richmond a laughingstock. The newspapers mocked him as Wilkinson the Incredible. He was a general without honor, a spy without a secret, a hero without a victory. But the tragedy of James Wilkinson is that shame was not a deterrent. It was merely an obstacle. He did not retreat into the shadows to reflect on his sins. Instead, he grew bitter. He grew paranoid. He convinced himself that he was the victim of a vast conspiracy of jealousy. And as he returned to his command, bruised but unbroken, a new opportunity for redemption or disaster was forming on the horizon. The tensions with Great Britain were rising. War was coming. The reign of terror in New Orleans had been a war against his own citizens, a war he could easily win with handcuffs and jail cells. But the War of 1812 would be a war against the British Army, an enemy that did not care about his political connections or his skill at forgery. Agent 13 had survived the courtroom. Now he would have to survive the battlefield. And, as we shall see, a man who has spent his life stabbing friends in the back finds it very difficult to look an enemy in the eye. History is replete with generals who sent men to die in the hail of enemy fire. That is the grim calculus of war. But there is a special darker circle in the inferno of military history reserved for commanders who kill their own men not with bullets, but with neglect. James Wilkinson, having survived the political assassination attempt of the Burr trial, was about to prove that his incompetence was far more lethal than his treason. The year was 1809. Thomas Jefferson had retired to Monticello, leaving the presidency to James Madison. The nation was drifting toward war with Great Britain. In this climate of anxiety, the government needed to secure the vulnerable port of New Orleans. And who did they send? They sent the savior, the man who claimed to know the city better than anyone, General James Wilkinson. It was a decision born of bureaucratic inertia. Wilkinson was the senior officer. To bypass him would be an admission that the military hierarchy was broken. So Madison signed the orders, and Wilkinson returned to the scene of his crimes. But this time, he wasn't hunting conspirators. He was tasked with assembling a grand army of 2,000 men to defend the southern flank. What followed was not a military campaign, but a massacre in slow motion. It is known to history as the Terre au Boeuf disaster, an event that lacks the glamour of a battlefield, but possesses all the horror of a plague pit. When Wilkinson arrived in New Orleans in the spring of 1809, he was ordered to find a suitable encampment for his troops, a place with fresh water, high ground, and good ventilation to avoid the yellow fever that haunted the lowlands. Instead, Wilkinson chose a spot 12 miles downriver from the city at a place called Terre au Boeuf, land of oxen. To the naked eye, it was madness. The site was a swamp. It sat below the level of the river at high tide. The ground was a sponge of black mud. The air was thick with clouds of mosquitoes so dense they could suffocate a man. There was no fresh water source. The only water available was the murky, sewage-laden sludge of the Mississippi River. Why did he choose this death trap? The detective lens reveals the answer: profit. Evidence suggests that Wilkinson had secret financial arrangements with the owner of the land and the contractors supplying the camp. By placing the army there, in an isolated spot accessible only by river, Wilkinson created a captive market. He could control the price of every barrel of flour, every side of beef, and every bottle of whiskey that entered the camp. He was essentially setting up a company town where the currency was the soldiers' health. The soldiers, many of them fresh recruits from the cool hills of Kentucky and Tennessee, began to arrive in May. They looked at the swamp and knew they were doomed. They lacked tents. They lacked mosquito nets. They were forced to clear the jungle in the suffocating heat, standing knee-deep in mud that smelled of ancient decay. Within weeks, the camp transformed into a necropolis. The fatal weakness of Wilkinson, his gluttonous ego, prevented him from admitting a mistake. When his regimental surgeons approached him pleading to move the camp to higher ground, Wilkinson dismissed them. He called them alarmists. He claimed the location was strategic. He refused to look at the sick lists, and the sickness was horrific. It wasn't just malaria or yellow fever, it was scurvy. Despite being surrounded by fertile land, the supply chain, which Wilkinson controlled, failed to provide vegetables or fresh meat. The soldiers were fed rotten salt pork and moldy hardtack. Their gums turned black and bled. Their teeth fell out. Their old wounds reopened. They wasted away, turning into living skeletons in dirty rags. Dysentery swept through the tents like wildfire. Because the water table was so high, latrines were useless. They instantly flooded, spreading human waste throughout the camp. The men were drinking, washing, and dying in their own filth. While his army rotted, James Wilkinson lived in a requisition plantation house miles away, enjoying the river breeze. He dined on imported delicacies. He drank his claret. He wrote letters to Washington describing the excellent spirits of the troops. It was a psychopathic disconnect. He viewed the soldiers not as human beings, but as units on a ledger, units that generated a daily per diem for supplies, regardless of whether they were standing at attention or lying in a shallow grave. The visuals of Terre au Bois are the stuff of nightmares. Eyewitness accounts describe men crawling through the mud because they were too weak to walk. They describe the sound of the death cart rattling through the camp every morning to collect the bodies of those who had died in the night. There were no coffins. The dead were wrapped in their blankets, if they had them, and buried in the mud, only for the rains to wash the soil away, exposing the corpses to the sun and the alligators. By July 1809, the Army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. It was a hospital ward. Out of 2,000 men, nearly half were dead or incapacitated. The stench of the camp was so overpowering that passing ships on the Mississippi would move to the far side of the river to avoid the smell of gangrene and death. Finally, the pressure became too great even for Wilkinson. The death toll was impossible to hide. In September, he ordered a retreat upriver to Natchez, but the retreat was arguably worse than the encampment. The sick soldiers were loaded onto open flatboats. They had no protection from the sun or the rain. As the boats drifted slowly upstream against the current, the men died by the dozens. Bodies were thrown overboard because the crews were too exhausted to bury them. The locals along the riverbanks watched in horror as the Grand Army floated past, a ghost flotilla of corpses and invalids. One officer, Captain Winfield Scott, who would later become a legendary general himself, was there. He watched Wilkinson's conduct with a burning righteous fury. Scott publicly called Wilkinson a traitor, a liar, and a scoundrel. For his honesty, Scott was court-martialed and suspended for a year. Wilkinson crushed dissent with the same ruthlessness he used to crush Aaron Burr. He would not allow the truth of his incompetence to be spoken aloud. When the final tally was made, over 1,000 American soldiers were dead. To put this in perspective, James Wilkinson killed more American troops in peacetime through sheer negligence and greed than the British Army would kill in many of the major battles of the coming war. He had decimated an entire division without firing a shot. The news of the disaster eventually reached Washington. The outcry was deafening. A congressional committee was formed to investigate. They interviewed survivors. They looked at the supply contracts. The evidence of gross negligence and criminal mismanagement was overwhelming. Wilkinson was summoned to Washington. He arrived, as always, With a blustering defense, he blamed the climate. He blamed the soldiers for being soft. He blamed the subordinates for not following orders. He brought with him piles of forged paperwork and coerced testimonies. And once again, the philosophy of political necessity saved him. President Madison was facing a crisis. The British were impressing American sailors. The war hawks in Congress were screaming for blood. The nation was on the brink of the War of 1812. The army was tiny, inexperienced, and leaderless. Most of the Revolutionary War veterans were dead or too old. Wilkinson, despite his reputation, was the only man left with experience, however fraudulent that experience was. Madison looked at the disaster of Traitor, and then he looked at the map of Canada. He needed a general who could lead an invasion. He reasoned that Wilkinson, for all his faults, was a survivor. Perhaps his ruthlessness could be turned against the British. So, in a decision that defies all logic and morality, James Wilkinson was cleared of wrongdoing. The dead of Traitor were written off as unfortunate casualties of the climate. Wilkinson retained his command, but the swamp of death had changed him. The laudanum addiction he had developed to cope with his chronic pain and his paranoia deepened. He was no longer the charming, sharp-witted chameleon of 1787. He was becoming a bloated, delusional wreck. He started to believe his own lies. He believed he was a military genius who was simply misunderstood by lesser men. As 1811 turned to 1812 and the declaration of war against Great Britain became inevitable, Wilkinson began to dream of a final redemption. He would go north. He would conquer Canada. He would silence his critics once and for all with a victory so decisive that they would have to build statues of him. He didn't realize that the fatal weakness doesn't just vanish, it compounds. The same arrogance, the same laziness, and the same greed that had buried 1,000 men in the Louisiana mud were now going to be tasked with fighting the disciplined professionals of the British Empire. The Agent 13 mask was slipping. The Spanish were no longer his primary concern. His own body and mind were failing. But he strapped on his sword one last time. The tragedy was moving toward its climax. The man who sold the West was about to try to sell a war, and the price would be paid in yet more American blood. War is the ultimate audit. In peace, a general can hide behind paperwork, parades, and political connections. He can bluff, bribe, and bully his way to prestige. But on the battlefield, the fog of war eventually clears to reveal the naked truth of competence. In 1813, the audit finally came for James Wilkinson. The War of 1812 was a conflict of strange contradictions for the United States. It was a war declared to defend free trade and sailors' rights. Yet the primary military objective was the conquest of Canada. It was a war fought by a young generation of war hawks who dreamed of glory, yet the army was led by the rotting stumps of the revolutionary generation. And the tallest, most rotten stump of them all was Major General James Wilkinson. When Wilkinson arrived at Sackett's Harbor, New York, in the late summer of 1813 to take command of the Northern Army, he was a caricature of a soldier. He was 56 years old, but he looked 80. His obesity had become grotesque. He required help to mount a horse. His face was a map of broken capillaries, the result of decades of heavy drinking. But the most dangerous element was invisible. He was chemically compromised. To manage the chronic pain of his gout and the stress of command, Wilkinson was consuming massive quantities of laudanum. The fatal weakness had evolved. It was no longer just greed. It was delusion, fueled by narcotics. Wilkinson believed he was about to deliver the masterstroke of his career, the capture of Montreal. The plan drafted by the War Department was sound in theory, but disastrous in personnel. It called for a pincer movement. Wilkinson would lead 8,000 men down the St. Lawrence River from Lake Ontario. Simultaneously, Major General Wade Hampton would march 4,000 men north from Lake Champlain. The two armies would meet near Montreal, crushing the British defenders between them. There was only one problem. Wilkinson and Hampton hated each other with a ferocity that eclipsed their hatred for the British. This was not a professional disagreement. It was a blood feud. They had despised each other for years. When Hampton learned he would have to serve under Wilkinson, he initially resigned, only agreeing to return if he could receive orders directly from the War Department in Washington, bypassing Wilkinson entirely. Imagine the absurdity. The two arms of an invasion force were not speaking to each other. The Secretary of War, John Armstrong, actually had to travel to the frontier to act as a referee between his two kindergarten generals. It was a recipe for catastrophe. In October 1813, Wilkinson's Grand Army launched its flotilla onto the St. Lawrence River. It should have been a terrifying sight for the British, hundreds of bateaux carrying infantry, cavalry, and artillery. But from the start, the expedition was cursed. The weather turned foul. Gales of freezing rain lashed the boats. Sickness broke out immediately. The ghosts of Terre aux Boeufs seemed to have followed Wilkinson north. But the greatest liability was the commander-in-chief. Wilkinson was rarely seen on deck. He spent the voyage confined to his cabin on a specially outfitted hospital barge, lying in a stupor of opium and brandy. He issued orders that were contradictory or nonsensical. He would order a landing, then countermand it an hour later. The officers whispered that the general was mad. The soldiers just shivered and died. By early November, the army had reached the rapids near a place called Chrysler's Farm, about 100 miles from Montreal. They were deep in enemy territory. The British, sensing the disarray of the Americans, had dispatched a flying corps to harass their rear. This British force, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Morrison, numbered barely 800 men. They were a mix of British regulars, the famous Redcoats, Canadian militia, and Mohawk warriors. Wilkinson had over 4,000 men available for battle, with thousands more in reserve. The math was 5-1. In any standard military academy, this is considered an overwhelming advantage. But on November 11, 1813, James Wilkinson performed his final act of military malpractice. As the battle began in the muddy, sleet-covered fields of Chrysler's Farm, Wilkinson was nowhere to be found. He remained on his barge, citing indisposition. He did not ride the lines. He did not observe the enemy. He delegated command to a subordinate, General John Boyd, but gave him no clear battle plan. The result was a slaughter. The American attacks were disjointed and piecemeal. Regiments marched blindly into the kill zones established by the disciplined British lines. The Redcoats, standing shoulder to shoulder in the freezing mud, delivered volley after volley of precise musket fire. The American lines wavered, broke, and fled. It was a humiliation. The Grand Army of the North was routed by a force a fraction of its size. It was the moment the myth of James Wilkinson finally shattered. He wasn't a man of destiny. He was just a fat, drug-addicted bureaucrat who had no business on a battlefield. When news arrived the next day that General Hampton, using Wilkinson's slowness as an excuse, had abandoned the campaign and retreated back to the U.S. border, Wilkinson didn't rage. He didn't try to rally his men to push on to Montreal alone, which he still could have done given his numbers. He felt relief. He had a scapegoat. Wilkinson ordered a retreat. The invasion of Canada was over, but the retreat was the final insult. As the army withdrew to winter quarters at French Mills, New York, the conditions were apocalyptic. The soldiers were starving. Their uniforms were in tatters. They built huts in the frozen wilderness, but the supply chain had collapsed. Scurvy and typhus returned. In that terrible winter of 1813 to 1814, the army essentially disintegrated. Wilkinson, however, was already busy fighting his favorite kind of war, the paper war. From his warm quarters, he unleashed a blizzard of letters to Washington. He blamed Hampton, he blamed the Secretary of War, he blamed the weather, he demanded a court-martial for Hampton, he demanded an inquiry to clear his own name, but this time, the magic didn't work. The philosophy of the situation had shifted. In the past, Wilkinson was protected because he was useful. Now, he was a liability. He had lost a campaign that should have ended the war. The public was baying for blood. The war hawks in Congress were humiliated. In March 1814, President Madison finally did what 4 presidents should have done before him. He relieved James Wilkinson of command. The untouchable was finally touched. Wilkinson demanded a court-martial. It was a bold gamble, one that had worked for him in 1808 and 1811. He believed he could once again bury the truth under a mountain of obfuscation. The trial began in Troy, New York, and dragged on for months. Wilkinson turned the courtroom into a theater. He accused the prosecutors of persecution. He portrayed himself as the victim of a jealous government. And in a verdict that stands as the final absurdity of his military career, he was acquitted. How? Why? Because the military tribunal was composed of fellow officers who were terrified of setting a precedent. If a general could be convicted for incompetence, who among them was safe? Furthermore, the paperwork was so messy, the orders from Washington so vague, and the blame so diffuse between Wilkinson, Hampton, and Armstrong that the court simply threw up its hands. They couldn't prove criminal intent, only monumental stupidity. Wilkinson walked free, but it was a hollow victory. The acquittal came with a caveat. On June 15, 1815, as the war ended, James Wilkinson was honorably discharged from the United States Army. The uniform was stripped, the epaulets were gone, the salary stopped. For the first time in 30 years, James Wilkinson was a civilian. He was 58 years old. He had no pension. The Spanish payments had dried up years ago when the revolution began in Mexico. He had no estate. He had squandered his money on land speculation. He had no friends. The graveyard of honor was full. He had buried his reputation at Chrysler's farm. He had buried his soldiers at Traitor. Now he was burying his career. But the creature inside him, Agent 13, was not dead. He was merely dormant. Wilkinson retreated to a plantation near New Orleans, the scene of his former glory, and looked in the mirror. He saw a ruined man, but he also saw a storyteller. If he could not command the present, he would command the past. He began to write. He spent his days in a drug-induced haze, scribbling furiously. He was writing his memoirs. But this wasn't an act of reflection. It was an act of revenge. He was going to rewrite American history with himself as the hero. He was going to settle scores with the dead, with Wayne, with Hamilton, with everyone who had ever looked down on him. However, writing didn't pay the bills, and Wilkinson had a lifestyle to maintain. He needed one last score, one last Faustian bargain. And as he sat on his porch looking south across the Gulf of Mexico, he remembered the old dream, the dream of 1787, the dream of 1806, the dream of empire. Mexico had finally won its independence from Spain. The Spanish Empire was gone, but a new nation was rising from the ashes, chaotic, wealthy, and naive. A nation that might need an experienced American general to tell them how to build an army. A nation that had land, Texas, to give away. The fatal weakness twitched one last time. Wilkinson stood up. He packed his trunks. He packed his code books. He was going to Mexico. Not as a spy this time, but as a prophet. He was going to sell them the only thing he had left, his own legend. He boarded the ship for Veracruz in 1822. He was leaving the United States forever. He was sailing toward his grave, but he thought he was sailing toward a new throne. The final masquerade was about to begin. There is a tragic symmetry to the life of a career con man. He begins by deceiving others, but inevitably he ends by deceiving only himself. In 1822, James Wilkinson stood on the deck of a ship bound for Veracruz, watching the coastline of the United States fade into the mist. He was 65 years old. He was obese, suffering from chronic gout, and heavily dependent on opium to numb the pains of a decaying body. To the world, he was a disgraced former general fleeing his creditors and his critics. But in his own mind, enveloped in the haze of laudanum, he was not a refugee. He was an explorer embarking on his greatest expedition. He was going to Mexico. The choice of destination was not accidental. For 35 years, Mexico had been the golden fleece of Wilkinson's mythology. It was the source of the silver dollars that had funded his lavish lifestyle. It was the target of the invasions he had plotted with Aaron Burr. It was the empire he had sworn to protect as Agent 13, and the empire he had offered to conquer as an American general. Now, with the Spanish Empire finally dead and Mexico a newly independent nation, Wilkinson saw a vacuum. And where nature abhors a vacuum, James Wilkinson saw a throne. When he arrived in Mexico City in 1822, the capital was a kaleidoscope of revolutionary fervor. After 3 centuries of Spanish rule, the country was free, but it was suffering from the vertigo of sudden liberty. The political situation was volatile. Agustín de Iturbide, a charismatic general, had just declared himself Emperor of Mexico. The treasury was empty. The army was restless. The diplomatic corps was confused. Into this chaos waddled James Wilkinson. He did not arrive as a beggar. He arrived with the pomp of a visiting dignitary. He brought with him his own trunks of uniforms, though he no longer had the right to wear them, and a chest full of maps. He checked into the finest quarters available and immediately began to work the room. His final masquerade was a performance of breathtaking audacity. He reinvented himself as the Sage of the North. He presented himself to Emperor Iturbide, not as the man who had failed to conquer Canada, but as the wise, battle-scarred elder statesman of the American Revolution. He claimed to be the intimate friend of Washington and Jefferson. He offered his services as a consultant on military and political affairs. It is a testament to his undying charisma, that specific fatal weakness that allowed him to charm his way out of court-martials, that the Mexicans believed him. Emperor Iturbide, desperate for international legitimacy and terrified of the United States, welcomed Wilkinson into his inner circle. Wilkinson became a fixture at the imperial court. He attended balls and state dinners, his chest puffed out, whispering advice into the emperor's ear. He advised Iturbide on how to structure the Mexican army, ironic given Wilkinson's record. He advised on trade policy with the U.S., ironic given his smuggling history. He was playing the role of the Gray Eminence, the power behind the throne. But Wilkinson was not doing this for charity. He had a specific price in mind. He wanted Texas. His plan in 1823 was a recycled version of the dream he had shared with Aaron Burr 20 years earlier. He petitioned the Mexican government for a massive land grant in the province of Texas. He proposed to bring in American settlers, good Catholic families, he promised, lying through his teeth, to create a buffer zone against the expansionist United States. He wanted to be the impresario, the feudal lord of a vast territory where he could finally live like the king he believed he was. For a few months, it seemed like he might actually pull it off. The grant was being drafted. The emperor was supportive. Wilkinson wrote manic letters back to the U.S., trying to recruit investors for his Texas colony. He was telling everyone that he was on the verge of becoming the richest man in North America. But the fatal weakness of Wilkinson was that he always bet on the wrong horse. He had bet on the Spanish just as their empire collapsed. He had bet on Burr just as he was exposed. Now he bet on Emperor Iturbide. In 1823, the Mexican political wind shifted violently. A coup d'etat overthrew Iturbide. The emperor was forced into exile and later executed. The Republic of Mexico was declared. Suddenly, Wilkinson's patron was gone. The man who had sat at the right hand of the emperor was now just an awkward, overweight foreigner associated with the fallen regime. A lesser man would have given up. Wilkinson simply pivoted. The chameleon changed colors one last time. He immediately began courting the new Republican leaders. He wrote letters denouncing Iturbide as a tyrant, the man he had praised weeks earlier. He declared his undying love for republicanism. He tried to sell his Texas plan to the new government, arguing that it was even more necessary now. But the magic was fading. The new Mexican leaders, men like Santa Anna and Victoria, were younger, sharper, and more cynical. They listened to Wilkinson. They accepted his flattery, but they kept him waiting in the lobby. They sensed the desperation on him. They saw the trembling hands, the dilated pupils of the opium addict, the stained cuffs of a man who was slowly running out of money. The years 1824 and 1825 were a slow, grinding descent into purgatory. Wilkinson was trapped in Mexico City. He couldn't afford to leave, and he had nowhere to go. His wife in America had died. His sons were estranged. He was alone in a foreign capital, surrounded by the ruins of his ambitions. He moved into cheaper and cheaper lodgings. The sage of the North was now just the old gringo. He spent his days sitting in cafes, drinking heavy chocolate and brandy, telling war stories to anyone who would listen. He spoke of the Battle of Saratoga, of his friendship with Hamilton, of the great days of the Mississippi. He was editing his own life in real time, erasing the treachery, polishing the glory, but his body was revolting against him. The dropsy, edema, caused his legs to swell so badly he could barely walk. The gout was agony. To cope, he increased his dosage of laudanum. The drug gave him vivid dreams, but left him in a fog of lethargy during the day. He was a prisoner of his own flesh. There is a profound philosophical tragedy in these final months. Here was a man who had manipulated the fate of nations, who had sold secrets that changed the map of a continent, now reduced to arguing with his landlord over a few pesos. He had spent his life chasing glory and fortune, the twin gods of his youth. He found neither. He found only dust and heat. Yet, even in the shadow of death, the merchant tried to make one last sale. He began writing a guide for American merchants on how to do business in Mexico. He was trying to monetize his exile. He wrote about the geography, the customs, the trade routes. It was a lucid, practical work, a glimpse of the brilliant intellect that he had squandered on crime. But time ran out. In the winter of 1825, the weather in Mexico City turned cold and damp. Wilkinson's health collapsed. He developed chronic diarrhea, likely exacerbated by his opium use. He took to his bed in his rented house, attended only by a few servants and an American diplomat who took pity on him. On December 28, 1825, James Wilkinson died. It was a quiet end for a loud man. There were no final words of wisdom, no dramatic confession. He simply ceased to exist. The engine of ambition that had driven him for 68 years finally ran out of fuel. The funeral was a modest affair. He was buried in the cemetery of the parish of the Archangel San Miguel. There was no military band. There were no representatives from the United States government. The nation he had served as senior general for 2 decades did not mourn him. It likely didn't even notice. In a final twist of irony that fits his life perfectly, the lease on his grave eventually expired. The cemetery was later closed and paved over to make way for the expanding city. Today, the bones of James Wilkinson, Agent 13, the double commander, the Emperor of the West, lie somewhere beneath the concrete and asphalt of modern Mexico City. He has no monument. He has no marker. The man who wanted to carve his name into history was erased by it. His death marked the end of an era. The generation of the founders, Adams and Jefferson, would die the following year, on July 4th, 1826, celebrated as gods. Wilkinson died 6 months before them, forgotten as a ghost. For decades, it seemed that Wilkinson had pulled off his greatest con. He had died without being fully exposed. Yes, people thought he was incompetent. Yes, they suspected he was shady. But no one knew. No one had the receipts. The Spanish conspiracy was considered by many historians to be a rumor, a political smear invented by his enemies. He had escaped the judgment of man. But history is patient. It waits in the dark, in the dusty corners of archives, in the wax seals of unopened letters. Wilkinson thought he had burned the evidence. He thought the ocean protected his secrets. He was wrong. While Wilkinson rotted in the Mexican soil thousands of miles away, in the cool stone vaults of the Archivo General de Indias in Seville and the Archivo Histórico Nacional in Madrid, the truth was waiting. The ledgers were there. The code keys were there. The letters signed Agent 13 were there. For nearly a century, they slept. Until one day a researcher blew the dust off a bundle of papers, opened it, and saw the familiar flamboyant signature of James Wilkinson. The masquerade was over. The autopsy was about to begin. For nearly a century after his death, James Wilkinson lay in his unmarked grave beneath the streets of Mexico City, enjoying the only thing he had ever truly successfully negotiated: silence. In the United States, his memory had faded into a sepia-toned ambiguity. History textbooks mentioned him, of course. They called him a controversial figure. They called him bombastic or incompetent. They acknowledged that he was a schemer who dabbled in land speculation and had a suspicious friendship with Aaron Burr. But the word traitor, with a capital T, the scarlet brand worn by Benedict Arnold, was rarely applied to him with certainty. There were rumors, certainly. There were the whispers from his contemporaries like John Randolph and Winfield Scott. But in the court of history, as in a court of law, you need the body to prove the murder. And for 90 years, the body of evidence was missing. Wilkinson had died believing he had won the long game. He had shredded his own papers. He had bullied his accusers into silence. He had taken his secrets to the grave. But the detective aspect of history is patient. It does not sleep. It waits for the wax seals to crack and the ink to fade just enough to be read by new eyes. The unraveling of James Wilkinson's final masquerade began not in Washington, but in Spain. In the early 20th century, a new generation of American historians, armed with curiosity and international passes, gained access to the great imperial archives of the Old World. They entered the Archivo General de Indias in Seville and the Archivo Histórico Nacional in Madrid. These archives are the catacombs of the Spanish Empire. They contain millions of documents, shipping manifests, royal decrees, vice-regal correspondence. It is a labyrinth of bureaucracy. But tucked away in bundles tied with rotting ribbon were the papel de Cuba, papers of Cuba, and the correspondence from Louisiana. When researchers finally opened these bundles, the ghost of Agent 13 rose from the dust. The discovery was not a trickle, it was a flood. It wasn't just a single incriminating letter, it was a decades-long ledger of betrayal. There, in the precise bureaucratic handwriting of Spanish clerks, were the receipts. Paid to General Wilkinson, $12,000. Pension for Agent 13, $2,000. Bonus for information regarding Kentucky, $4,000. The historians found the First Memorial of 1787, where Wilkinson swore allegiance to the Spanish king. They found the Reflections of 1804, where he advised the Spanish to intercept and arrest Lewis and Clark. They found the cipher keys, the very code books Wilkinson had used to communicate with his handlers while serving as the senior officer of the U.S. Army. The smoking gun was no longer a metaphor. It was a mountain of paper. The revelation was shattering. It forced a complete rewrite of the early history of the American Republic. It turned out that the controversial general wasn't just a bad apple. He was a foreign asset planted at the very top of the military tree. He was the Manchurian candidate of the 19th century, long before the term existed. As we stand at the end of this journey, looking back at the wreckage of Wilkinson's life, we must perform the final psychological and philosophical autopsy. We must answer the question, what was he? He was not a tragic villain like Benedict Arnold. Arnold was a hero who broke. He fought bravely at Saratoga, lost his leg for his country, and turned traitor only when he felt betrayed by Congress and his own pride. There is a Shakespearean quality to Arnold's fall. James Wilkinson was something far darker and far more modern. He was a sociopath of the state. His fatal weakness, that hamartia we have traced through 10 chapters, was a complete and total absence of a moral center. He did not betray the U.S. because he loved Spain. He did not betray Spain because he loved the U.S. He betrayed both because he loved James Wilkinson. He viewed nations not as causes to be served, but as clients to be billed. He was the ultimate mercenary. He monetized his oath of office. He treated the stars on his shoulders as marketing assets. In the modern world, we recognize this archetype. He is the corrupt CEO who strip mines his own company for bonuses before bailing out. He is the politician who sells policy to lobbyists while waving the flag. Wilkinson was the prototype of the bureaucratic monster, the man who uses the machinery of the state to feed his own appetite. But the verdict of history must also fall on the society that enabled him. The story of Agent 13 is not just about a bad man, it is about a vulnerable system. How did he survive for so long? How did he serve 4 presidents, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, without being caught? The answer is the philosophy of the necessary evil. The early United States was a fragile thing. It was a strip of civilization on the edge of a savage wilderness. The loyalty of the West was never guaranteed. The presidents in Washington, sitting in their comfortable parlors, were terrified of the frontier. They feared it was ungovernable. Wilkinson survived because he positioned himself as the gatekeeper. He convinced the East that only he understood the West. He convinced the West that only he could talk to the East. He made himself the indispensable translator between two worlds. Washington tolerated him because he needed a man who could talk to the Kentucky secessionists. Adams promoted him because he needed a counterbalance to Hamilton. Jefferson protected him because he needed a witness against Burr. Madison kept him because he needed a general for the war. Each president thought they were using Wilkinson. In reality, Wilkinson was using them. He was the parasite that convinced the host it couldn't survive without him. He weaponized the deep state secrets he held. He knew where the bodies were buried because he had dug the graves himself. The tragedy is the cost of this tolerance. The cost was the 1,000 men dead in the swamps of Terre aux Boeufs. The cost was the betrayal of Lewis and Clark. The cost was the humiliation of the War of 1812. The cost was the corrosion of the Army's honor. There is a supreme irony in his legacy, however. If James Wilkinson had been a better man, he might have been a worse traitor. Think about it. Wilkinson was, at his core, incompetent. He was lazy. He was a drunkard. He was a drug addict. His grand schemes, the separation of Kentucky, the invasion of Mexico, the conquest of Canada, all failed. If he had been a man of discipline like Anthony Wayne, if he had been a man of intellect like Aaron Burr, if he had possessed the competence to match his treachery, he might have actually succeeded. He might have fractured the Union. He might have carved out that Western Empire. The United States was saved not by the vigilance of its leaders, but by the ineptitude of its traitor. Wilkinson's fatal weakness, his sloth and his gluttony, ultimately saved the Republic from his ambition. He was too busy eating, drinking, and scheming for petty cash to execute the grand treason that could have destroyed the nation. Today, if you visit the West Point Museum, you will not find a statue of James Wilkinson. You will not find high schools named after him. His name has been scrubbed from the honor rolls, but he is there. He is the shadow in the corner. He is the ghost in the machine. His story serves as a permanent warning to democracies. It warns us that character is not just a quaint, old-fashioned virtue. It is a national security requirement. It warns us that charismatic men who wrap themselves in the flag are often the ones using it to blindfold us. It warns us that institutions are only as strong as the people who staff them. Agent 13 died in 1825, but the archetype of Agent 13 is immortal. As long as there is power to be brokered, secrets to be sold, and egos to be fed, there will be men like James Wilkinson. In the final analysis, Wilkinson did not sell the West. The West was too big, too wild, and too free to be sold by one fat man in a general's uniform. He tried to sell it, yes. He took a down payment on it. But in the end, he was just a renter. The land remained, the nation survived. And James Wilkinson, he is just dust beneath a Mexican street. A man who wore two faces until he forgot which one was real, leaving behind nothing but a legacy of ink, lies, and the cold, hard silence of the archives.